Kira Vasquez had spent 6 months learning how to be small. Not physically small, because she could not change her height of 5 feet and 6 inches, but small in the way she moved and breathed and existed in spaces filled with aliens who flinched. Whenever she walked too fast, the Galactic Integration Academy floated in orbit around a gas giant that humanity had no name for yet, because humans were new to everything out here. In the stars, and naming rights belonged to species who had been traveling between worlds for thousands of years before. Earth even developed fire. Kira was 17 years old, and she was the first human ever accepted into the Academy's diplomatic training program, and every single day she felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. The Academy was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache sometimes. When she looked out the observation windows at the swirling storms of the planet below and the distant stars that her ancestors had once wished upon, without knowing that those tiny lights were suns with worlds and people and civilizations beyond counting. But beauty did not make a place feel like home. Her quarters were too cold because the station's environmental systems were calibrated for species who preferred temperatures that made Kira want to wear 3 sweaters at all times, and her bed was shaped wrong because the designers had never imagined a human would sleep in it. And the food in the cafeteria was usually something she could not identify, let alone eat. She survived on nutrition bars shipped from Earth and the occasional fruit that one of the kinder professors imported for her. Today was a Tuesday by Earth reckoning, though. The Academy used a different calendar system that Kira still had not fully memorized, and she was walking to her conflict resolution class with her shoulders deliberately hunched and her steps deliberately slow. A group of Volanti students passed her in the corridor, and she saw the way their neck frills flattened against their scales, which was their species' involuntary fear response. And she pretended not to notice, because noticing would only make things worse. The galaxy knew what Earth was. They called it a Class 12 Deathworld, which was the second highest danger rating any planet could receive, and the classification meant that Earth was a place of extreme gravity and unpredictable weather and venomous creatures and predators that had evolved to kill in 1,000 different ways. The fact that humans had not only survived on such a world, but had thrived and built civilizations and developed technology and reached the stars was something that made other species deeply uncomfortable. Kira understood their discomfort. Even if she wished they could see past it, she was not a monster. She was just a girl who happened to come from a planet where monsters were everywhere, and you either learned to live alongside them or you did not live at all. The classroom was a wide circular space with seats arranged in ascending tiers like an amphitheater, and holographic projectors built into the ceiling for educational displays, and she took her usual seat near the back where she could see all the exits without turning her head. This was not something she did consciously anymore, because it had become as automatic as breathing after 17 years of being human on a world where awareness of your surroundings could mean the difference between life and death. Her classmates filtered in over the next several minutes, and she watched them without appearing to watch them, because that was another skill Earth had taught her. Velith arrived first, and the crystalline being's body caught the light and scattered it into rainbows as they moved, and Kira had always found the Sarati beautiful, even though Velith had made it clear on multiple occasions that they considered humans to be primitive evolutionary accidents who had somehow stumbled into space travel through sheer dumb luck. Tomo 7 came next, and the synthetic being's optical sensors flickered in what Kira had learned to recognize as a friendly greeting, and she allowed herself a small smile in return, because Tomo 7 had never treated her as anything other than a fascinating subject of study, which was honestly the closest thing to friendship she had found at the academy. Then Resik entered the room, and Kira felt her shoulders tense before she could stop them. The Volani was tall and broad, and covered in scales that were darker green than the Volantes, and he moved with the confidence of a predator species that had once ruled their world through strength and violence before they had developed civilization. His people had a warrior culture that stretched back tens of thousands of years, and they had been one of the dominant powers in the galaxy before the formation of the current alliance. And they did not appreciate the fact that humanity had gone from first contact to full membership in less than 50 years. Resic had made his feelings about humans very clear over the past 6 months. He called Kira Deathworlder, as if it were an insult, and he questioned her presence in every class discussion, and he had once told her directly that her species was a plague that would eventually destroy everything the galaxy had built. She had reported him to the administration, and they had given him a warning, and nothing had changed today. He walked past her seat, and his clawed hand brushed against her desk, and she saw something flicker in his yellow eyes that made her instincts scream danger in a voice that was older than language. But she pushed the feeling down because she was trying to be civilized, and civilized people did not react to every perceived threat with the readiness for violence that Earth had bred into her bones. Professor Ilmve entered the room last, and the ancient Mindari's presence seemed to fill the space in a way that had nothing to do with physical size, because the professor was actually quite small by most standards, but there was a weight to them that came from centuries of accumulated wisdom. Today we will discuss de-escalation through understanding predator-prey dynamics, the professor announced, and their voice resonated in that strange harmonic way that Mindari voices always did, and Kira sat up straighter because this was a topic she actually found interesting. The lights dimmed for a holographic presentation, and in the sudden darkness, Kira's eyes adjusted faster than anyone else's in the room, because human eyes were designed for hunting at twilight when prey animals thought they were safe, and in that darkness, she saw Resic's hand move slowly beneath his desk, and her heart began to beat faster because she recognized the deliberate, careful motion of someone reaching for a weapon. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself that this was a school, and violence did not happen in schools on civilized stations in the middle of civilized space. But her body did not believe her, and her muscles began to coil with the readiness that a million years of survival had written into her DNA. The presentation began to play, but Kira was not watching it. She was watching Resic's shadow in the dim light, and she was counting his breaths, and she was preparing for something that she desperately hoped would not happen. But hope had never been a survival strategy on Earth. The blade caught the light from the holographic display, and for one frozen moment, it seemed to hang in the air like a sliver of captured starlight. Kira recognized it immediately because she had studied Valorni culture as part of her preparation for the academy, and she knew that the curved weapon in Resic's hand was a Kelvath blade, which was used in traditional honor killings and was absolutely forbidden on any station or ship outside of Valorni-controlled space. The punishment for carrying one was immediate expulsion and criminal charges. Punishment for using one was death. Resic did not seem to care about either consequence as he rose from his seat, and his voice filled the suddenly silent classroom with words that dripped with hatred and righteous fury. "The human infestation ends today," he announced, and his yellow eyes swept across the room but kept returning to Kira with the focus of a predator who had already chosen his prey. "Their kind does not belong among civilized species, and I will prove it by removing their representative from our presence." Professor Vei's harmonics shifted into frequencies that Kira knew were meant to be calming and soothing, but the ancient Mindari's voice wavered with something that might have been fear. "Student Resic, please lower your weapon, and we can discuss whatever grievances you have in a peaceful manner that does not require violence or threats." The professor's words were textbook de-escalation technique, and Kira could almost hear the chapters being quoted as Vei spoke, and she knew with absolute certainty that they would not work. This was not anger. This was not a momentary loss of control that could be talked down with soothing words and promises of understanding. This was ideology, An ideology did not respond to reason. Resik laughed, and the sound was harsh and cold and completely devoid of humor. "You cannot de-escalate truth, Professor," he said, and he took a step toward the seated students and 31 beings from 11 different species shrank back in their seats with the instinctive response of creatures who had never in their lives faced real physical danger. "Humanity is a disease, and I am the cure." Kira watched him move, and her brain began to do something that she had never been able to explain to anyone who was not human. Time seemed to slow down, not actually slow because that was impossible, but her perception of it shifted as her body flooded with chemicals that her ancestors had developed over millions of years of facing threats that wanted to eat them or crush them or poison them or tear them apart. Her heart rate dropped instead of rising because panic would not help her now, and she needed the steady rhythm of a predator at rest. Rather than prey in flight, she cataloged information without conscious thought. Distance from her seat to Resik, 4.2 meters length of the blade, approximately 30 centimeters, his grip on the weapon, too tight, which meant his muscles would fatigue quickly, and his strikes would be less precise than they could be. His stance. Weight shifted forward onto his toes, which meant he was eager and emotional, and that made him predictable. His eyes focused on Valith, who was the closest student to him, and whose crystalline body would shatter beautifully under the edge of that blade. Kira understood in that moment that Resik was not planning to come for her first. He was going to kill someone else in front of her and make her watch. And then he would turn to her with the blood of her classmates still wet on his scales. The other students were frozen in their seats, and Kira knew. Why? Because she had studied the evolutionary histories of every species at the Academy, and none of them had come from worlds anything like Earth. The Sarati had evolved on a planet with no predators larger than insects. The Lanthi came from tropical wetlands where camouflage and stillness were the primary survival strategies. The Mindari had developed intelligence so early in their evolutionary history that they had never needed physical defenses. None of them had ever faced a situation where violence was coming for them and there was nowhere to run, and hiding would not save them. Their bodies did not know what to do, so they did nothing. But Kira was human. Her ancestors had faced saber-toothed cats and cave bears and wolves that hunted in packs and rival tribes, who wanted their territory and their food and their lives, and somewhere along the way evolution had given humans a gift that no other species in the galaxy seemed to possess: the ability to turn off fear when fear would get you. Kira felt herself grow calm in a way that should have been terrifying, but instead felt like coming home. Her breathing slowed, and her muscles relaxed from tension into readiness, and her vision sharpened until she could see the individual scales on Resik's hand and the slight tremor in his blade arm that told her he was not trained in actual combat despite his warrior culture's traditions. He was a student playing at being a killer. She was a daughter of Earth. There was no comparison, but even as her body prepared itself for what was coming, her mind was screaming at her to stop and think about what she was about to do. She had spent 6 months trying to prove that humans were not monsters. She had moved slowly and spoken softly and kept her eyes down and done everything she could to show that her species was worthy of trust and friendship and a place among the civilized peoples of the galaxy. What she was about to do would destroy all of that work in 3 seconds. The other students would see what she really was, and they would never look at her the same way again, and every fear they had ever had about humanity would be confirmed in the blood and violence of this moment. But Valith was sitting 3 meters from a blade that was about to descend, and Kira could not let an innocent being die just to protect her reputation. She had never been able to watch suffering without acting bad. Was human to Resik raised his blade, and his muscles tensed for the strike that would shatter Valith's crystalline form into 1,000 glittering pieces, and Kira was already moving before he finished lifting his arm. The first second began when Kira's feet left the floor. She did not run, because running was for prey, and prey died when predators were faster, and she was not. Prey right now. She flowed. Her chair became a shield as she grabbed it mid-stride and brought it up between herself and the descending blade, and the metal shrieked as the Kelvath edge bit into the seat where her body had been moments before. Isaac's eyes went wide with shock because he had not seen her move, and that was the thing about humans that no other species truly understood until it was too late. They were persistent predators, which meant they were not the fastest creatures on their world, but they could maintain high speeds far longer than species that relied on explosive bursts of motion, and more importantly, they could accelerate from stillness to violence in the space between heartbeats. The chair absorbed the blade's momentum, and Kira used that momentum against him by twisting and pulling and watching his grip falter for just a fraction of a moment. The first second ended. The second second was for closing distance. Kira released the chair and stepped inside his guard before he could pull the blade free, and her movement was so smooth that it looked almost gentle, like a dancer gliding across a stage rather than a predator striking at prey. His eyes met hers, and she saw the moment he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. There was no fear in her expression, because fear was a luxury she could not afford right now. There was only calculation and focus and the cold, clear certainty of a species that had learned 10,000 years ago that hesitation meant death. Palm connected with his wrist, and she did not strike to hurt because hurting was not the goal, and the goal was to end this threat as quickly and cleanly as possible. She struck to disrupt. The impact traveled through his arm and interfered with the nerve signals that told his fingers to grip, and the blade spun away from his suddenly nerveless hand and clattered across the floor toward the far wall. He tried to grab her with his other hand because he was still bigger and stronger, and his warrior instincts were finally catching up to what was happening. But she was already moving again, her foot hooked behind his ankle, and she pulled and pushed at the same time, and his superior mass became a liability rather than an advantage as physics took over and sent him crashing toward the floor. The second second ended. The third second was for control. Resic landed hard on his back, and the breath rushed out of his lungs in a sound that was almost like a word. Kira followed him down, and her knee pressed into his chest, and her hands found his arm, and she twisted until the joint was locked in a position that would dislocate his shoulder if she applied one more pound of pressure. She did not apply that pressure. She held him there on the edge of serious injury, and she breathed slowly and steadily, and her heart rate was exactly where it had been before any of this started. The third second ended. Classroom was completely silent, except for the harsh, ragged sound of Resic's breathing and the soft hum of the holographic projector that was still playing its presentation about predator-prey dynamics to an audience that was no longer watching. Kira looked up and saw 31 faces staring at her. Not that Resic at her. She saw horror in some of those faces and shock in others, and something that looked almost like awe in a few. And she understood that everything she had worked for over the past 6 months had just been destroyed in 3 seconds of violence. Tomo 7's optical sensors were flickering rapidly, which meant the synthetic was processing data faster than normal, and Kira knew that every moment of what just happened was being analyzed and recorded in perfect detail. Vleth's crystalline form was trembling, and the column Sarathi's surface was reflecting Kira's image back at her, multiplied and distorted, and she saw herself, as they must be seen here, a small human female barely reaching the shoulder of most species at the academy, holding down a Valorni warrior who outmassed her by at least 50 kilograms, looking absolutely and completely bored. That was the part she knew they would never forget. Not the speed or the violence or the brutal efficiency of her movements. The fact that she looked like she had done this 1,000 times before and could do it 1,000 times again without ever breaking a sweat. Professor Vey had not moved from the front of the room, and the ancient Mindari's multiple eyes were all fixed on Kira with an expression she could not readdress. It began to struggle beneath her, and she adjusted her grip slightly. And the pain that shot through his arm made him go still again. "Please do not move," she said, and her voice was calm and level, and she could hear how wrong that sounded in a room full of people who were still processing their own terror. "I do not want to hurt you." She meant it. She had never wanted to hurt anyone, but she was human, and humans had been forced to learn violence so thoroughly that they had become the most dangerous beings their planet had ever produced. Not because they were evil, not because they enjoyed killing, but because the alternative was extinction. Resic stared up at her with something in his eyes. That might have been fear or hate or both, and she realized that she had just become exactly what he had always claimed humans were: a monster, a killer, a threat to everything civilized species had built over thousands of years of peace. And she could not even argue with him anymore, because he had just seen what she was capable of, and there was no way to unsee that. The silence stretched on and on, and Kira waited for security to arrive and take this situation out of her hands and let her go back to being the small, quiet human girl who sat in the back of the classroom and did not remind anyone that she came from hell. But Professor Vey broke the silence first. "Miss Vasquez," the ancient Mindary said, and their voice was steady in a way that surprised Kira, because she had expected fear or condemnation or something other than this calm curiosity. "Please continue the lesson." Kira stared at the professor, and she was not sure she had heard correctly. "What?" she asked. "You heard me," Professor Vey said, and there was something almost like a smile in their harmonics now. "This is a class about conflict resolution, and you have just resolved the conflict more effectively than anything I could have demonstrated with holograms and lectures, and I believe your classmates would benefit from understanding exactly what just happened and why you want me to teach." Kira said slowly. "I want you to explain," the professor replied. "I have been teaching this subject for 200 years, and I have never seen anything quite like what you just did, and I suspect the explanation will be more educational than anything in our curriculum." Kira looked down at Resic, who was still pinned beneath her. She looked up at her classmates, who were still staring at her with expressions ranging from terror to fascination, and she realized that this might be her only chance to change what they had just seen, not hide from it, not pretend it had not happened, but explain it in a way that might help them understand that humans were not the monsters the galaxy feared. They were something much more complicated than that. Kira took a deep breath and adjusted her position slightly to make sure Resic could not escape while still being able to look up at her classmates. Security was probably 3 minutes away, based on typical response times at the academy, and she had 3 minutes to change how 31 beings from 11 species would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. She had never been good at speeches, but she had always been good at truth. "You are all afraid of me right now," she began, and her voice was steady, even though part of her wanted to run and hide and never face any of these people again. "I can see it in the way you are looking at me, and I understand why, because what you just saw was terrifying. No one spoke, no one moved. They were still frozen in the aftermath of violence they had never expected to witness. The galaxy thinks humans are dangerous because we come from a Class 12 Deathworld," she continued. "You have all heard the stories about Earth and about the creatures that live there, and about the fact that our planet seems to actively try to kill everything that exists on its surface." She paused and looked at Velith, whose crystalline body was still trembling. "Those stories are true," Kira said. "Every single one of them, and probably more besides, because Earth has been trying to kill us for millions of years, and it has not stopped yet." "Then why?" Velith's voice was thin and high, and Kira could hear the fear vibrating through every syllable. "Why did you not kill him?" It was a fair question. It was the only question that mattered, because that is not what Earth taught us, Kira said, and she felt the weight of her entire species' history pressing down on her as she spoke these words that she had never said aloud before. You think we are dangerous because we come from a death world, but that is backwards. She shifted her grip on Resik's arm to keep him secure, and he hissed in pain but did not struggle. We are dangerous because everything on our planet tried to kill us, and we refused to die, she continued. Not because we were the strongest or the fastest or the most venomous, because we were none of those things. Her eyes moved across the room, meeting the gaze of every student who would look at her. Humans were never the apex predators of Earth, she said. We were persistence predators, which means we survived by being patient and adaptable, and by being willing to take damage that would kill other species. Tomo 7's optical sensors focused on her with obvious fascination. Our ancestors chased prey for days at a time, running and walking and running again until the other creature collapsed from exhaustion, because we can regulate our body temperature in ways that most species cannot, she explained. We can survive injuries that would be fatal to almost any other being on our world, because our bodies are designed to keep functioning through pain and blood loss and trauma. She looked down at Resik, but the most important thing Earth taught us was not how to kill, she said quietly. It was how to choose when to kill and when to stop. Professor Vey made a soft harmonic sound that Kira had learned to interpret as encouragement. Explain further, please. The ancient minder, he said. Kira nodded and took another breath. Resik expected me to freeze or run, she said, because those are the two responses that evolution programmed into most species when they face a threat they cannot defeat through combat. She gestured with her free hand at the other students. Your ancestors survived by hiding or fleeing or submitting to predators that were stronger than them, she said, and there was no judgment in her voice, because evolution was not something to be ashamed of. Those were good strategies on your worlds, and they kept your species alive long enough to develop intelligence and technology and the ability to reach the stars. But human ancestors could not hide from saber-toothed cats in caves. We shared with them, she continued. We could not outrun wolves that hunted in packs and never tired, and we could not submit to rival tribes who wanted our resources, because submission meant death. She felt Resik tense beneath her, and she adjusted her grip again. So evolution gave us a third option, she said. The ability to become the most dangerous thing in the room for exactly as long as necessary, and then stop. The classroom was silent, and the quality of the silence had changed from fear to something that might have been understanding. That is what you saw, Kira said. 3 seconds of controlled violence designed to end a threat as quickly and safely as possible, and look at the result. She gestured at Resik. He's alive, she said. He is uninjured except for some bruises and the strain on his shoulder joint, which will heal in a few days. And I did not break anything or draw any blood or cause any permanent damage. She looked at Velith. You are alive, she said. Everyone in this room is alive, because I chose to stop the threat rather than destroy it. But you could have killed him, Velith said, and it was not quite a question. Yes, Kira admitted. I could have killed him in the first second if I had wanted to, and there was nothing he could have done to stop me, because he is not trained for real violence, and I have been training since I could walk. The crystalline being's trembling slowed slightly. Then why did you not? Velith asked again. Kira smiled, and it was a sad smile, because this was the part that no one ever seemed to understand. Because I did not need to, she said simply. Humans do not want to be monsters, even though we know how to be, and we have learned through thousands of years of civilization that violence is a tool and not a purpose. She looked around the room again. I could have killed him, but killing him would not have solved the problem, she said. It would have created more problems, because his family would want revenge and his species would demand justice, and the cycle would continue forever. She pressed down slightly on Resik's arm, and he grunted. But now he is alive, and he will face the consequences of his actions through the legal system that all of our species have. Agreed upon, she continued. And maybe he will learn from this experience, and maybe he will not, but at least he has the chance to learn. Professor Vey moved closer, and the ancient Mindari's multiple eyes were shining with something that looked almost like tears, and that, the professor said, is why humanity terrifies us so much more than you realize. Kira looked at Vey with confusion. Not because you are violent, the professor continued, but because you are so perfectly controlled in your violence that you can choose mercy in the middle of a fight and make it look easy. The words hung in the air, and Kira felt something shift in the room. Fear was still there, but it was no longer alone. There was curiosity now, and something that might have been respect, and she realized the professor Vey had understood something that she had not known how to say herself. Humans were not dangerous because they could kill. They were dangerous because they had learned exactly when not to, and that kind of control was far more frightening than mindless violence could ever be. 1 week passed, and Kira waited for the consequences to destroy her. She expected to be expelled, or at least suspended because she had used violence on another student, even if it was in defense of others, and the academy had strict policies about physical confrontations. She expected to be shunned by her classmates, who had seen what she really was and would never be able to look at her the same way again. She expected to receive messages from Earth telling her that she had failed her mission and ruined humanity's reputation and set back diplomatic relations by years. None of that happened at Resic. Was expelled within 24 hours of the incident, and criminal charges were filed against him for possession of a forbidden weapon and attempted murder, and he was extradited to a neutral station where his trial would take place under galactic law. The news spread across the galaxy faster than Kira could have imagined, and the headlines were everywhere she looked. Human student disarms Valorni attacker in seconds. Nitrogen monoxide casualties. Deathworld. Reflexes on display at Galactic Academy. Is humanity the future of galactic security? The coverage was mixed, and Kira tried not to read too much of it because some of the commentators were calling for humans to be banned from all diplomatic spaces, while others were suddenly very interested in alliance negotiations with Earth. But what surprised her most was what happened at the academy. She was walking to her quarters on the third day after the incident when she found Veleth waiting outside her door. The crystalline Sarati was standing very still, and their surface was reflecting the corridor lights and patterns that Kira had learned to associate with nervousness. "May I speak with you?" Veleth asked, and their voice was quieter than Kira had ever heard it. "Of course," Kira said, and she opened her door and gestured for Veleth to enter and tried not to show how confused she was. They sat facing each other in the small living space that Kira had never bothered to decorate because it had always felt temporary. Veleth was silent for a long moment, and then they asked a question that Kira had not expected. "Will you teach me?" Kira blinked. "Teach you what?" she asked. "How to not be afraid," Veleth said, and their crystalline form shimmered with colors that Kira had never seen before. "I have spent my entire life avoiding anything that might hurt me, because my species is fragile and we shatter so easily, and I thought that was wisdom." They paused. "But you showed me something different," Veleth continued. "You were not afraid even when you faced a blade that could have killed you, and I want to understand how that is possible." Kira thought about the question for a long time before she answered. "I was afraid," she admitted, "but I was more afraid of what would happen to you if I did not act, and that fear was stronger than my fear for myself." Veleth tilted their head. "That does not make sense," they said. "It does not have to make sense," Kira replied with a small smile. "It just has to work." That conversation was the first of many over. The next several days, more students approached Kira with similar questions, and she found herself holding informal discussions in the common areas, in the cafeteria, and even in the corridors between classes. They did not want to learn how to fight because most of them knew they would never be capable of the kind of violence Kira had displayed. They wanted to learn how to be brave. They wanted to understand how a species that came from a world of constant danger had learned to face that danger without breaking. Tomo 7 recorded everything with the synthetic's usual fascination, and Kira suspected that the data would eventually make its way into some academic paper about human psychology. She did not mend in the seventh day. Professor Vey summoned her to a private meeting in the Mindari's office. The room was filled with plants from a dozen different worlds, and the air was warm and humid in a way that reminded Kira of summer on Earth, and she felt herself relax for the first time since the incident. "Please sit," Professor Vey said, and gestured to a chair that was shaped correctly for a human body, which meant the professor had ordered it specifically for this. Meaning Kira sat and waited. "I have been teaching conflict resolution for 200 years. Professor Vey began, and their harmonics were low and thoughtful. "I have studied every species in the galaxy and their approaches to violence and peace, and I thought I understood the full range of possibilities." The ancient Mindari's multiple eyes focused on Kira. "I was wrong," Professor Vey said. "I have never seen anyone resolve a conflict so completely in 3 seconds. I just stopped him," Kira said, and she was not sure why the professor was making such a big deal out of something that had felt so simple in the moment. "No," Professor Vey replied. "You did much more than that, and I do not think you realize what you actually accomplished." The professor stood and moved to a window that looked out at the swirling storms of the gas giant below. Resic believed that humans were monsters. Professor Vey said he believed that your species was a threat that needed to be eliminated before you could harm the civilizations we have built over thousands of years. Kira nodded because she had heard this belief from many species since humanity's first contact, and in 3 seconds, you proved him both right and wrong at the same time. Professor Vey continued, "You proved that humans are exactly as dangerous as everyone fears, and you proved that you choose not to use that danger to hurt others." The Mindari turned to face her. "The galaxy fears humans because they do not understand you," Professor Vey said. "They see Deathworld, and they think monster because that is the only framework they have for understanding a species forged in such a hostile environment. But you are not monsters," the professor continued. "Your planet did not make you into killers, and it made you into protectors instead, because you learned violence so thoroughly that you understand exactly when not to use it." Kira felt something shift inside her chest, and she realized that she was crying. She had spent 6 months trying to hide what she was, and she had spent her entire life apologizing for the accident of being born human on a world that the galaxy considered hell. And here was this ancient being telling her that she had nothing to apologize for. "That is not a curse, Miss Vasquez," Professor Vey said gently. "That is a gift, and the galaxy needs it more than you know." That night, Kira sat in her quarters and looked at a photograph from Earth that her mother had sent with her when she left for the academy. It showed her family standing in their backyard with their dog at their feet, and the sun shining down from a sky that was impossibly blue. She had spent 6 months trying to be less than what she was. She had hunched her shoulders and slowed her steps and kept her eyes down because she thought that was what the galaxy needed from humanity. But Professor Vey was right. The galaxy did not need humans to be less, it needed them to be exactly what they were, a species that walked out of hell and decided to be kind anyway. The next morning, Kira walked into class without hunching her shoulders or slowing her steps. She let them see the predator in her movements and the awareness in her eyes that tracked every exit and every threat and every fragile being in the room that she would protect without hesitation. If the need arose, she was a daughter of Eartha, child of the Deathworld, and she had never been more ready to be human. Valeth caught her eye across the room, and the crystalline Being's surface flickered with colors that Kira had learned to recognize as greeting and friendship. She smiled back and, for the first time since she had arrived at the academy, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be.